He spoke about it recently at Martin Luther King Middle School in Berkeley, California, for about an hour, 45 minutes.
Well, Chalmers, let's just get the... Oh, sorry.
How is this?
Thank you for not being shy. Is this okay? I hate nuance. That's so French. We wouldn't want to be that. Chalmers, why don't we just get the essential out of the way right off the bat? Would you explain blowback and nemesis?
Blowback is a CIA term. It's used first in the after-action report on the first overthrow of a foreign government we ever carried out, that in 1953 against Mohammad Mossadegh of Iran for the sake of the British Petroleum Company. We accused him of being a communist. Pope would have probably been a better candidate. It does not mean just retaliation. Obviously, that's what it means, is retaliation. It means retaliation for acts committed abroad that were kept totally secret from the American public, so that when the retaliation comes, they're unable to put them in context to see cause and effect. The best example being, of course, September 11th, 2001, which was retaliation by former assets and associates of ours against us for the largest single clandestine activity we ever carried out, namely the recruiting, arming, sending into battle of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Osama bin Laden was the sort of person you would have logically expected to meet as a house guest at Kennebunkport, Maine, in the first. That is, and he became so disgusted by the way we walked away from Afghanistan after the Soviet Union withdrew in 1988 that he and his associates have been after us for some time. Certainly, 2001 was not out of the blue, and it was not a clash of civilizations. He had very, very specific things in mind, made it clear to the world within a week after 9/11. In fact, he went out of his way to say that there are three things that we had in mind. I mention them simply because they're all casus belli. They're not grand statements of clash of values, or we dislike you because of your democracy or your wealth or whatever else. He said that we attacked the United States because of your placing American troops in Saudi Arabia after the first Gulf War. We disliked intensely the use of non-believers charged with defending the House of Fahd, which is responsible for the safety of the two most sacred sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina. He said that you Americans will never know peace so long as you continue to back Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people and the seizure of their land. And third, he properly accused us of killing at least 500,000 Iraqi children in the most fierce set of sanctions we ever imposed on any country, that is against Iraq during the 1990s under Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright. Again, these are perfectly recognizable reasons for asymmetric warfare, as to use a bit of Pentagon jargon, but I prefer it to terrorism. And they followed along a long pattern that had been going. But that's blowback, is basically saying that is, I wrote the book well before 9/11 with East Asia in mind, thinking that the main foreign policy problems of the 21st century were going to be things left over from the last century as they came back to haunt us. In fact, even on March 11th itself, I was chatting with my publisher in New York about, once we had known that it was a terrorist incident, that it didn't cross our minds at once at all that they were Islamic terrorists, least of all Saudi Arabians. The first thought we had, March 11th, everybody in Latin America knows that date, March 11th, 1973, the day the CIA overthrew... I beg your pardon? Oh, September, I beg your pardon. Yeah, I was thinking the month we're living in now, right? September 11th, 1973, the day that we overthrew the government of Salvador Allende in Chile and installed probably the most odious dictator on either side in the Cold War, General Augusto Pinochet. It could have been Okinawans, it could have been Greeks, it could have been any number of people that have legitimate reasons to wish to attack us. Nemesis is a different story. You wanted to hear about that one, yes, too. Nemesis, as all of you, or a good many of you will know, is the Greek goddess of revenge, of the attacker of hubris, of arrogance. She is classically portrayed as a bright young woman with a whip in one hand and a scale in the other. She was a very legitimate and high-class goddess. She was the sister of Erato, the goddess of love poetry. Probably Edith Hamilton, in her great work on Greek mythology, says that probably the greatest single act of Nemesis was she's the one who came across Narcissus in the forest and led him to the pond and showed him his reflection in the water, and he fell in love with it and dove in and drowned. The sort of things that. But I'm contending that Nemesis is present in the country today, biding her time before she starts settling the scores with some people who have shown remarkable hubris. The essential argument of Nemesis is simply that there is no politically, history tells us there is no more unstable configuration than that of the United States today, namely a domestic democracy and an external empire. You can do one, you can do the other. You can't do both. They are fundamentally conflict with each other. I try to explain why they are and what happens when you try to do both. The classic examples are, of course, the Roman Republic, which is important to us because so many of our constitutional provisions were adapted from the Roman Republic, which succumbed after the assassination of Julius Caesar and the rise of Octavian to military dictatorship. Democracy did not return for at least 1,000 years. It was the first great experiment in large-scale experiment in political democracy, and it failed in a way that would be easy to expect today in the United States. That is to say, militarists. By this time, the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, had acquired an empire rather thoughtlessly, much like the United States, paid not much attention to it, took it as its due, and the old legions that were raised among the citizenry for purposes of defense had now become standing armies with huge vested interests, great problems of what to do with the troops after they became redundant. They were long service troops by now. Under those circumstances, exploitative militarists, Caesar being easily the best example, began to think that they might champion the interests of the armed forces in return for life dictatorship. That's precisely what did happen, and whether you, I mean, if you know you're given, you would think that the first, that is Octavian declaring himself to be the god Augustus Caesar, was not a bad thing. That this was a big improvement over the endless bickering and arguments of the wonderfully balanced Roman Senate. But do bear in mind what followed Augustus Caesar. Then came Tiberius, who withdrew to Capri with a boatload of young boys for his sexual tastes. He was succeeded by Caligula, a genuine madman, rightly understood as such, but who did at least help perfect the Praetorian Guards, which became very important in Roman history. He was then succeeded by a drooling idiot, Claudius, whose wife fed him a poisoned mushroom to get rid of him, and for the sake of her son by an earlier marriage, namely Nero. Now, I mentioned these characters simply to say this is not good government, no matter how you look at it. This is, I mean, the Republic may have. The alternative, I try to suggest, if you can find there are not many cases of the opposite. There are very few cases of empires that ever gave up. Gorbachev is probably the only one in recent times that really did. But I argue that the British Empire, after World War II, against Nazism, and in view of the record of Nazism that had been put on for the world to see and to understand, or to attempt to understand, that in these circumstances, the British realized they could not hang on to the jewel in the crown of their empire, India, without resorting to, as they had so many times in the past, administrative massacres. Administrative massacres would not have been, that is, in order to continue to carry them out, Britain would have had to transform itself into a tyranny. There would have been really no alternative. Therefore, they gave up their empire. It wasn't too hard for them to do because they did have the United States that they could come under its wing. But they gave up the empire, particularly India, for the sake of maintaining domestic democracy. I believe it's something we in America ought to be thinking very, very hard about ourselves. Our empire is now, the official count, 737 American military bases in well over 130 countries. And they provide nothing that we need or want, but they're simply expensive, and they're a form of hegemony. Now, the British didn't do a very good job of this. There were huge atavistic throwbacks afterwards. The damn near genocide against the Kikuyu in Kenya, the Anglo-French-Israeli attack on Egypt in 1956, and then, of course, the latest, best atavistic case we've got is Tony Blair, who, of all the places you'd have thought an Englishman would have kept away was the bastard child that they had created called Iraq. But they didn't, and they certainly, you have to say, the British do enjoy militarism. You've got to watch the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace one day just to realize how much they truly enjoy it. But that's more than you wanted to know.
Oh, go on.
It is, but Nemesis is then spinning out these issues. The intervening variable between, as this social scientists like to say, jargon, the causative link is militarism. That is, you can't have an empire without having an army, and that's where the troubles all begin. And they're fatal. To go in that direction. I mean, it's astonishing to talk about such simple-minded things that the Americans pay no attention anymore. I mean, the opening of every new Congress, by law, we read Washington's farewell address. What did Washington say? The greatest enemy of liberty is standing armies, and it is the particular deadly enemy of Republican liberty. Well, that was a long time ago, and he was dead right. That is, he knew exactly what he was saying, what he had in mind. And do we have a standing army? Well, I'll tell you, it's a biggie.
Well, I like one of the things I like most about Nemesis is its emphasis on Rome as a cautionary example. And I recommended to you the documentary Why We Fight. And I find about every 2 years after we have a so-called election, I go down to the local video store and rent all of Masterpiece Theater's I, Claudius and watch it. And every 2 years it becomes more relevant. And one of the things, as Chalmers said, is that you start with Augustus, who seems pretty awful.
Yeah.
But by the time you get to the end of the 15 or 16 hours, in fact, you can see why they called it a golden age. Because at the very least he was sane. And
most of them after that weren't. Yeah.
Exactly. And so it becomes more relevant all the time. So I highly recommend you watch I, Claudius again.
If you're into that sort of thing, you can watch Rome on HBO, too.
That's right.
Once you start, you won't be able to put it down. And,
Well, you likened yourself to Gibbon, and I think
I did not know. I did.
I likened you to Gibbon. After all, the subtitle is "The Last Days of the American Republic."
Yes,
so,
yes. He took 6 volumes. I took only 3.
You have been likened to Jeremiah too. But,
Yes, there's also.
yes, I think of you as Cassandra because, of course, Cassandra was cursed to tell the truth and not to be believed. Although I think you are being believed more and more as we slog deeper into this quagmire.
Maybe so. I find that the new book is being better received than the first 2 were. And by the way, this was an inadvertent trilogy. I certainly didn't set out to write 3 books on this theme. One grew out of the other. But the public, or the public that I'm talking to, this kind of public, is more receptive, considerably more worried. I do mean the subtitle. I'm not just trying to sell books. I'm trying to tell you I can't see the way out. I can't imagine any president of any party that could possibly stand up to the vested interests of the military-industrial complex or the secret intelligence agencies, particularly the Central Intelligence Agency. There's simply no way that this could be done. And even then, the system, the political system, has, for all intents and purposes, failed us. That we have a good constitutional provisions for dealing with an unsatisfactory political leader, one that lies us into war or spends us into bankruptcy or whatever else it may be. It's called impeachment. So wait. Last November, the public elected the opposition party, and the first thing Mrs. Pelosi said is that impeachment is off the table. Well, if it's off the table, then democracy may well be off the table too. That's it. We're spinning our wheels, and the system doesn't work anymore. That's what's gone wrong. If you think the government in Washington, D.C. has any resemblance to that outlined in the Constitution of 1787, the burden of proof is on you.
You talk about how little Americans are permitted to know about just what their government is doing, and since the present war is couched by those such as Samuel Huntington in terms of a war of civilization against barbarism, I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the extent of cultural destruction which is going on throughout the Middle East. The burning of the libraries in Baghdad in the first week of the invasion was considered so unimportant by the Chronicle that it didn't even merit an article. We heard about the museum that was destroyed there. We really don't know very much about what was done around the rest of the country, and as a matter of fact, throughout the Middle East. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, it's one of my charges against these people. The others are more serious, certainly Abu Ghraib and things of this sort. But there is no question that Nemesis is in search of those who commit hubris, stupidity, arrogance, things of that sort. You can't imagine the arrogance of the Marine Corps writing Semper Fi, or spray painting Semper Fi, that is their slogan, on the side of the ziggurat at Ur. Then they had to guard it so that the press couldn't photograph it. The destruction of the main gates at in Nebuchadnezzar's palace, the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, which in Greek, Mesopotamia, is the absolute cradle of civilization. The place is rife with artifacts that cry out for protection. That in one prominent place we had tiles and other spaces laid out at the time of Alexander the Great that were all cracked by our tanks driving over them. The numerous sites are simply unusable today. At the Great Tel El Air Base, next door to the ziggurat, the sort of stepped pyramid at Ur, one of the a Sumerian building, one of the oldest places on Earth, where we have two 10,000-foot runways today, and at Talil Air Base prominently promises that they've just opened a new Burger King. Makes the troops allegedly feel more at home, they claim, the aroma coming from it. I mean, what can you say? That is, Robert Fisk of the London Independent, and a great Middle Eastern specialist, had warned on the day that it occurred that the Library of Qurans was afire, and that the Marine Corps could have put it out. The Marines simply sat around and said, "We got a guy here who's telling us there's a museum of Bibles that's burning," and of course nothing happened. We protected one institution, the oil ministry. These are the sort of things that come back to haunt us, that are going to come back to haunt us. The indifference to what was happening. Rumsfeld's cracks about stuff happens, and that it looked like an endless tape of people carrying vases out of the National Museum that had been established by Miss Bell back in the 1920s when the British, when this was a British territory. It's a terrible tragedy, but we had 4 people in the Army who spoke Arabic. 4. Compared that with the effort we made, say, during the Japanese War, during World War II, in which we trained thousands of Japanese linguists at Boulder and at the University of Michigan, many of which went on to become the absolute backbone of Japanese studies in this country. Ed Seidensticker won the Nobel Prize for his translations of Kawabata, things of this sort. This was just scandalous. The war was going on for 2 years, apparently, before the president actually got it through his head that there is a difference between Shia and Sunni Islam, and that Iraq was ruled by a dictatorial Sunni minority government. Now, if you overthrow it, the majority comes to power, and that's what they've done, and they ally themselves with the Shia superpower next door, Iran, and it's hard to say, even from a neoconservative point of view, how this served the interests of the United States, Israel, or anybody else. But it's with that kind of incompetence, you could expect the other greater disasters, such as Abu Ghraib, for which probably the United States will never truly recover. Let me just say, Rick and I ran into each other today. Right here on the Berkeley campus are Ferdinand Bottero's Abu Ghraib paintings in the library, and I admire your book so much, and particularly its chapter on the University of California. I feel embarrassed to compliment the place, but it was a
I do too.
Yes, of course you do. But it was important, I think, that the University of California did take these paintings after they'd been turned down by virtually every museum in the country. And
I think it was the Center for Latin American Studies.
The Center for Latin American Studies that did it, and I gather then that there were people in the administration who could control their enthusiasm for what was going on. But they are fascinating, unbelievable pictures by a very prominent Colombian painter who many people also know that he did an earlier series on drug wars in Colombia that are truly Goya-esque. They're fabulous things. If you haven't seen them, go see them. They're still there for 2 more weeks in the Doe Library.
In all of this, I mean, particularly as the war started, when I mentioned in the new introduction to my book that I was able to watch in the Free Speech Cafe the students enjoying the spectacle of Baghdad being pulverized on a CNN screen up above.
Shock and awe.
Yes, and it's you know, there's no question, in fact, that we have made violence one of our most popular forms of entertainment. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the responsibility of the media in all of this. It seems to me that one of our problems is happy talk TV and hate talk radio.
Yeah.
I was just recently in Times Square, and I looked up and I saw these broadcasting towers on top of the high-rises, and they looked to me like gigantic steel syringes injecting soporifics and other poisons into the public mind. So I wonder if you could make a few remarks about the role of the mass media in this crisis which we're now involved in.
Well, it's obviously a huge subject, but it does seem to be palpable and not really even argumentative anymore, that the citizen cannot possibly play the role that, for example, say Benjamin Franklin had in mind, for the role of the informed citizen exercising elementary oversight on the government. In the first place, even members of Congress can't. I mean, everything the CIA does is secret, and it's secret above all from the Congress. It is the 40% of the defense budget is black, has been since, that's not Bush, it's been since the University of California's great contribution, since the Manhattan Project. And the Supreme Court has dithered around it for years. Article 1 says the citizens will be told, ultimately, given an accurate accounting of how your tax dollars are spent. That hasn't been true in the United States for well over 60 years, and there's no sign that it likely will be. The stonewalling on the Freedom of Information Act is certainly it's the worst we've seen. The orders that both Gonzales and his predecessor as Attorney General put out to stop virtually all requests, if you possibly can, have made it impossible for people to follow what's going on. The press has failed us. That is, Article 1 of the Constitution was not written to protect People magazine. Nobody actually gives a damn whether they it was written for a very explicit reason. The press's function was given these protections in order to penetrate the bureaucracy and expose it to public view. That's its purpose. It's not supposed to be particularly entertaining or anything else. It's supposed to get behind what's going on in Washington. They haven't done that. They've failed us terribly. The New York Times has become just a classic of what's wrong. I mean, Gore Vidal's crack about the function of the New York Times is to enter the battlefield after the battle is over and shoot the wounded is essentially what they do. And they're out there right now having a wonderful bloodbath. But they certainly weren't when Michael Gordon and others were reporting on weapons of mass destruction in Saddam Hussein's arsenal. Television is hopeless. I mean, we know that because of, that is to say, it's owned by conglomerates. It functions to make advertising revenue, and it's terribly misleading and ill-informed. And I'm afraid you're probably also right. They're fascinated by explosions and fast-flying aircraft and things of this sort. So how could you expect the public to play this role? That it's not difficult to lead them around by the nose, particularly then when you get a government that is so utterly committed to secrecy as this one is. It's the cancer on the government right now, and it's growing exponentially. Just in many ways, just to demonstrate that it can be done, that they can keep this much information from the general public, and that's one of the reasons why there's a lot of things wrong, in any one of which probably could be corrected through effective political action. The mobilization of inattentive citizens to this, that, or the other thing could make a difference. There's too many of them now. There's more than one. You can't keep your eye on them all. It is more than likely that we are talking about the short, happy life of the of the American Republic. Whether we give up our empire or we have a military coup, or we, as my prediction, that we go toward bankruptcy, that my wife keeps saying to me, come up with something optimistic, would you? And I said, I've got something. Bankruptcy, a financial whimper rather than a nuclear bang. But it wouldn't mean literally the end of the United States any more than it did for Germany in 1923, or China in 1948, or Argentina just in 2001 and 2. It certainly does mean a drastic lowering of your level of living, the end of any influence over the rest of the world, a howling recession, and great impulses toward revolution domestically when these things occur. So that and it could be happening as we talk. People are getting awfully tired of being paid in worthless dollars, particularly China and Japan. But as for the press, it's just another one of the failures to see how easily it has been co-opted, to see how cooperative it has been with this government in particular, and the unbelievable things that have happened. I live in the 50th district of California. It's in northern San Diego County. Many of you will be aware that our congressional representative, Randy Duke Cunningham, is now spending 8.5 years in a federal penitentiary for being the worst bribee in the history of Congress. But it's important to stress he was bribed by the military-industrial complex. I mean, he claimed to be a hero of the Vietnam War, things of this sort. The local press, everybody took it on fine. He finally only got caught when he used a cover to make an extra $700,000 by selling his house in Del Mar and charging more for it than you could conceivably imagine. And one of his defense contractors paid for it. I mention this to say, though, that the press wasn't following this. They weren't paying any attention. I wrote an article in the LA Times about Cunningham's, how he was financed by Lockheed Martin and Boeing and the rest of them. I thought it was a good article. I got several letters from people in the 34th District in downtown Los Angeles saying, God, I wish he was my congressman. I could use a good job. That I wouldn't mind making bomblets or something like that. That's good pay. That's the problem, I think. That is that the public, we could only be saved by restoration of the constitutional system with the same sorts of checks and balances that block dictatorship or tyranny. The president goes around saying, I am the decider. It's hard to think of a more anti-constitutional remark. Like hell he's the decider, that we do it by committee, just as the old Roman Republic had 2 consuls, and they changed office every other month, and they could veto anything the other one did. Veto is a good Latin word. Certainly by the time the Republic came to an end, it took an awful lot of Ciceronian guile to make the Senate work. You had to produce compromise. It was impossible to dictate. We now have the most obvious imperial presidency. I find it impossible to understand. I mean, I think it's easier to understand Bush and Cheney than it is to understand what happened to Congress, where they just blew away, that they didn't perform any of their oversight functions. Not that they ever did, in the areas of oversight where they might have made a difference. The Central Intelligence Agency had no form of oversight on it at all until the late 1970s, with the Church Committee that set up the 2 congressional oversight committees. But remember how they worked. It was a washout on Iran-Contra when Charlie Wilson of the Texas 2nd District became chairman of the committee, he rather famously wrote to the Central Intelligence Agency, to his friends there, to say, the fox is now in the hen house. Do anything you want to. That was oversight. And it's right now. It's nothing better. The press didn't report this, didn't follow it. It wasn't that hard to do either. People just vaguely well-informed could have followed it. There are lots of sources of information on this sort of thing. But it failed and may well be too late.
Well, that brings us to the responsibility of the public itself, and particularly the degree of passivity to which they accepted the coup d'etat of 2000,
yes.
and now receive Sandra Day O'Connor as some sort of icon of moderation and feminism when she comes around to warn people about the growing tendency towards tyranny in the United States. Probably no other person is more responsible
yes.
for that coup d'etat. How would you credit the United States public with this, as particularly after the affirmation of 2004?
Well, precisely. Remember that election. I mean, that is no question that in 2002 the president was appointed by a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court. But the election of 2004, and he did not win in 2000 the electoral vote. In 2004, he won by 3.5 million ballots. That made his war, his pictures from Abu Ghraib, his budgets that were truly threatening bankruptcy. Those things became, in the eyes of the world, ours. We had all now endorsed them, and that's precisely why it's very hard any longer to listen to people talk about a political solution or to suggest maybe another dynastic cycle of more Bushes and more Clintons would change something. I don't believe it. I don't see how that's going to make any difference. So that I think I just have to leave it at that. As for the public, certainly one could imagine abstractly a mass mobilization of the public comparable to, say, the civil rights movement of the 1960s that determined to retake the Congress, reconstitute it, and cause it to return to its original purpose, throw away all the old saws, metaphors about swinging pendulums, and we swing one way, but then we swing back, don't worry about it. This is an exceptional country, et cetera, et cetera.
It didn't work in Germany.
Yeah, exactly. You could imagine it, but I don't see how, with the size of the country, the enormous difficulties of mobilizing such a diverse population, the conglomerate control of the main sources of information today. Rupert Murdoch is threatening to buy 30% of the Los Angeles Times. This kind of thing. It's very, very hard to imagine how this could happen, except to notice that there are larger audiences interested in these subjects in a less than academic way. Or I've discovered also a growing number of people at gatherings of this sort who want to ask me personally, what do you think I could do? And my wife says, I swear to you, you just cannot once again say, if you've got a little money ahead, buy that condo in Vancouver.
Terrible earthquakes up there.
Yeah, start preparing your escape route. I said it the other night on TV, in which somebody had pushed me. I said, I'm 75 years old. I decided to write it out. But but I say I did do a little elementary research. I happen to have a geriatric Russian blue cat that I'm extremely fond of, so I did research to see what countries around the world would accept an elderly couple with their cat without quarantine. It turns out the Spaniards don't give a damn about this sort of thing. My wife happens to have a degree in Spanish literature. We thought, Malaga, here we come.
Well, after watching Why We Fight, which is about the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower warned us, and I believe he left out congressional. I think he was going to put that in.
Famously, he intended to say the military-industrial congressional complex, but it was members of Congress who warned him off, we know from his papers. Let me just say about the film, I was very pleased to be included. I do believe Jarecki probably overstates Eisenhower, though. That is, he was the butcher of Guatemala.
Mossadegh.
Certainly the Mossadegh affair, he was easily bamboozled by the British. He had presided over this unbelievable growth of the military-industrial complex, particularly the Air Force, and it appalled him when he realized that it was now out of control, and that, moreover, it was starting to penetrate deeply into the society. That it's perfectly logical for the Secretary of Defense to want to close military bases that are redundant, useless, or go back to the Civil War. Every time he tries it, it would happen in Berkeley if you had a military base here. The newspapers, the preachers, and everybody would say, "Oh my God, save our jobs! We need to keep open the sewer gas campus as a bomb disposal base or something of that sort." It goes on endlessly. I mean, I've said it before, but I think it's apropos. The state of Washington has two really lovely women, relatively liberal senators who have represented their state well. Say the word Boeing to them, and before your very eyes, they will turn into bloodlusting fascist hyenas.
Sounds like Feinstein.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, their function is to keep Boeing in business. The two mother hens of the Defense Facilities Subcommittee of the Senate Armed Services Committee are Kay Bailey Hutchinson of Texas and Dianne Feinstein of California. The states with the two largest number of military bases, and they regard their business in this world is to keep those bases functioning, keep people employed. The military-industrial complex is very good at this sort of thing. On a big project like the B-2 bomber, they put a piece of that in as many constituencies as they possibly can. It sort of runs the price up terribly, too, just so that if anybody got the idea, any man or woman in Congress, that we didn't need a new weapon of mass destruction, they could be put out of office the next election by firing a good many of their constituents. This is what I'm in the book calling military Keynesianism. It certainly wasn't an idea of John Maynard Keynes. It's not what he meant by it. But it does refer to the use of the defense budget, so-called, or the military establishment's funds, which is considerably more than the Department of Defense, for purposes of maintaining as close to full employment as possible, to influence the level of employment in the society, to make work, and to live with the vicious cycle that it sets up. That is, bigger weapons mean more wars mean bigger weapons, so that we go to war with great regularity now.
Well, that's why I wanted to add to the military-industrial congressional complex the academic component of that, and particularly because we are here in Berkeley. As you probably know, the University of California has two top-secret campuses, one of them not even in California, Los Alamos. They were deliberately set up by Edward Teller and Ernest Lawrence to compete with one another to produce the very best means of mass destruction. And
let me just say, we think we all know a lot about that, but your book is truly revelatory.
Well, thank you.
I mean, I thought that it was beautifully put together in a way that it wasn't just the usual, was J.R. Oppenheimer nuts, or that which we're forever reading about. It really did link it so powerfully to industrial interests here in California, and it's an appalling story that has never really, I think, seen the political light of day.
No, and I don't think it can. It's extremely secret. The administration does not want to talk about it, does not want to have the public associated, which is why you don't see Oppenheimer's name anywhere on campus. You see Lawrence's name everywhere, but Oppenheimer, no, you don't. And it becomes worse, I think, with every passing year, because just last Friday, the Department of Energy announced that the Lawrence Lab would be developing a new generation of nuclear weapons. Why we need them, we weren't told, but we were told that a few years ago when they renewed the contract for Los Alamos, where the university will serve as a fig leaf for Bechtel, that the labs would be run now more like a business whose product is nuclear weapons. So you don't get the idea of what a thermonuclear bomb could do to a city, in fact.
Yes.
But it's extremely lucrative, and I might say that the head of the Board of Regents, financier Richard Blum, has extensive military interests, actually, and his wife is Senator Dianne Feinstein, who sits on the Appropriations Committee of the Senate.
Right.
And this is something that the Chronicle has not carried, actually.
Well, here, as I say, when we were going to get together for this, I sat down and started reading your book and learned more than I really needed to know about the history of mining in California. And
you never can know too much.
No, sure that's
especially
true.
about uranium.
But when I came to the chapter on the University of California, I really sat bolt upright. You've done a superb job.
Well, thank you. You were in the Department of Political Science. Which
it's hard to believe what a scandalous organization that was.
I'm in the Department of Geography, which actually budded out of the Department of Commerce around the time of the Spanish-American War to find out what was actually out in the Pacific, and particularly in terms of resources.
The interesting thing, though, is that you're seeing the university as still playing a malevolent role, whereas my thought would have been, just going back to your question about the media and the information level of the public and things of that sort, that there was a disastrous failure of the universities, particularly in the social sciences, in the 1990s, when they, I was a former member of the Council on Foreign Relations. I actually resigned over Sam Huntington's article about the clash of civilizations. I was told rather bluntly, no one ever resigns from the Council of Foreign Relations, they die. And I said, well, I'm resigning because I'm not dead yet. But nonetheless, they went 5 years without ever publishing a single article on Iraq. And what went wrong? A lot of things have gone wrong. The way in which fundraising has devolved from trustees to deans and people like that, who are actually rather good at it, enjoy it, find it easier than performing their function of quality control over very complex institutions like departments. The crazy enthusiasm for the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Prize is an almost unmitigated disaster academically. It drives everything toward fundamental theory, drives money away from engineering, from applied work. My late colleague, rather famous political scientist, Aaron Wildavsky, once asked Assar Lindbeck of the Nobel Prize Committee why they didn't give a prize in political science. And Lindbeck responded and said, "Oh, we do. It's the literature prize." If you could write a novel as good as Solzhenitsyn, we'll give you a prize, Aaron. But it is what happened. I think was the disaster of the Reichsbank of Sweden giving Nobel Prizes in economics. Economics used to be a useful social science. Today, it is mostly simultaneous equations and other forms of gibberish that add up to almost nothing, but that the other social sciences are out to duplicate them. Now, what this meant is that people quit teaching, really. They started writing articles for each other that nobody read. They were normally weighed in dean's offices, unpublishable junk that just went...
I read quite a bit of that.
Pardon me?
Yes.
You know what that is to say. It is proved to me such a relief to finally retire. Life after the big organization. I no longer have to pretend my colleagues are smart. Which, as a former chairman of political science, at one time I did have to do that.
What a relief.
I believe that that is to say, the failure is not just one of malevolence or of vested interests. I also think it has been a rather serious intellectual failure in not doing this sort of work that would have contributed to oversight of the government, democratic controls, the sort of providing the kind of information that the professoriate would be able to do, and that the public certainly could use.
Mm-hmm. Well, as long as we're talking about economics, let's talk about your idea of military Keynesianism. And many of these neocons, of course, just detest Franklin Roosevelt, see him as something close to Satan. Would you compare the kind of Keynesianism that produced schools, airports, roads, sewers, etc., with the kind of Keynesianism that we have now?
Yes, well, John Maynard Keynes, I particularly admire him, very famous English economist and of enormous influence. One of the things I always loved, particularly given my background as a consultant of the CIA, many people have asked, what on earth happened to you? Boy, did you change your mind. And I think you're being inconsistent. Keynes, when once accused of being inconsistent, rather famously said, when I get new information, I change my position. What, sir, do you do with new information? Which is some of the new information I got was how fast after the collapse. I mean, there's no question. I was a Cold Warrior. I thought the Soviet Union was a menace. I still do. But that it was astonishing how remarkably rapidly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, our government set out to find a replacement enemy. To keep the military-industrial complex at work. China, drug lords, terrorism, even instability. Isn't that we needed a defense establishment for that too. But it is the university. It seems to me has not carried on, held up standards of the sort of critical information that we needed, the critical stance toward our government, understanding what was necessary, and we're paying a great price for it now.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to read a few of the quotes that you have
right.
in
You want me
Nemesis.
to talk about military Keynesianism?
Yes, please do.
Military Keynesianism is certainly not something that Keynes invented. It was actually the name was invented by a Polish economist during World War II to explain the first German economic miracle, Adolf Hitler's restoration of full employment in the late 1930s through military spending, and also that Keynesianism, this was, Keynes's idea was that when the economy is so depressed that simply people don't have enough money to buy anything buy anything at all, that it's important to start putting money in the hands of consumers. And he proposed counter-cyclical job creation. Some of it was, he thought were great ideas. The Triborough Bridge, the Grand Coulee Dam, all of those sorts of things that were part of American Keynesianism. But he also said we should just do make work, put money in disused mines and pay unemployed workers to go down and dig it up. Mm-hmm. It at least gives them something to do, and we'll start getting the economy back in place. He also genuinely meant it as countercyclical. We do this in times of depression, but when we'd regained a degree of employment, we would then go back to effective ending deficit spending and pay down the budget and things of this sort. That's certainly one of the changes in military Keynesianism. It never stops. I mean, once you get hooked on living off of munitions making, there is no cure. There is no backing down from it. The term, I mean, we spent well over $5 trillion on nuclear weapons between the 1940s and the height of the stockpile in 1966. The one was never used. Of course, we're lucky that one was, except for the two in Japan. But that it's a perfect example of Keynesianism. It's spending a huge amount of money to put people to work, none of it having ever showing up in the military budget. This is the Department of Energy, which is entirely separate and never included when Rumsfeld goes around telling you what a small and declining percentage of gross domestic product the military budget is. This is the kind of nonsense that the press accepts when there are geniuses in Washington that can explain it to you in a half hour, and they write good books on the defense budget. Most of them actually work for the Republican Party in the budget committees. They've worked there for 30 years, and they know every trick in the trade, how it's done, earmarks, one thing after another, and they generally remain working on Capitol Hill. They don't go to work for AEI or the Heritage Foundation or something like that, these right-wing think tanks that dominate Washington these days. But it is to try and to just simply compare the simple appropriation, simple. It's $750 billion right now. It's larger than all other defense budgets on Earth combined, and that's the straightforward appropriation, including the funding for 2 wars. But then you're starting adding in nuclear weapons. You add in the entire separate budget for defense facilities, that is 737 American military bases abroad. Leave aside the ones domestically. Defenders of the Pentagon like to say, oh, you're wrong. You're just talking about Marine Guards in embassies. I guarantee you there aren't any 737 embassies anywhere. I mean, there aren't that many countries. We're talking about real military, real, genuine, healthy American rapists. And inflicted, I mean, revolt has been endemic in Okinawa since the Battle of Okinawa of 1945. That is, there are 37 American military bases on an island smaller than Kauai in the Hawaiian Islands. It's a place, it's an American Puerto Rico. I mean, it's a Japanese Puerto Rico. The Japanese acquired Okinawa late in the 19th century, adapted it into the Japanese Empire. It had always been discriminated against. It's a dumping ground for Americans. The Japanese government likes the Japanese-American Security Treaty. They also know that the Japanese public largely likes it. But the one thing they don't like, they don't want American troops located anywhere even slightly close to them. Therefore, you put them down in Okinawa, a place with no political clout. The rate of sexually violent crimes committed by American servicemen in Okinawa leading to court-martial, which is important because that means the woman came forward and testified, which in Japanese culture is relatively unusual. The rate is, and has been now for 60 years, 2 per month. It goes on and on and on. Nothing comes of it. All of this is, these are the costs of, I'm starting to ramble, aren't I? These getting off into my pet irritations. That is to say, one of the largest items in the defense, in the military establishment that is never accounted for is interest payments on the debt on all the previous wars. Mm-hmm. That's in the Treasury Department, of course. Then we have the whole issue of veterans' benefits and treatment of the remarkable veterans from Iraq who have survived wounds that normally would have killed them, and has now led to this scandal of another scandal of remarkable incompetence. But the costs of paying for our wounded are simply skyrocketing. That's, of course, in the Department of Veterans Affairs, not in the Pentagon. Foreign military sales is done by the State Department. So that once you start looking throughout the government at all the things that add up, military Keynesianism doesn't sound quite as outre as it may coming from me.
Well, in the book, you talk about how things like the Star Wars, so-called Star Wars
Yes.
defense system, is better. It really doesn't matter whether we use it or not. I mean, it
Right.
serves the function of using up a
hiring
lot of
people,
money.
yes.
But it looks like we're about to have another spasm, and I'd like to wrap up with talking about our drive towards war with Iran. Back in September, there was an amazing op-ed piece in the Chronicle by somebody named Bennett Ramberg, who it was called "Bomb Tehran Now or Be Bombed Later," and this is Tehran, not Natanz. And the conclusion of that article was that the United States had better launch a conventional attack upon Iran so that Israel will not launch a nuclear attack upon it. In January 7th, the Sunday Times of London reported that it had a report showing that there are advanced Israeli plans to launch a nuclear strike on Iran. Well, you combine this with Seymour Hersh's articles, and I just wondered if you could say something about Israel's role in this kind of imperial cosmology and especially this drive towards war now with Iran.
Well, of course, Israel is a ward of the United States, and we are determined to protect it. It's written in, it's part of our defense budget, is the several $billion annually that goes to Israel, and with relatively few controls over how the money is spent. Moreover, as an Israeli attack on Iran is an Israeli-American attack, just as the famous Israeli attack on the reactor at Osirak. We laid down a radar trail for our F-16s that Israeli pilots were flying to get there and hit the thing properly. The Israelis have asked for a new one. I mean, they would like to have a new electronic map put on the ground to guide them to Iran. It's hard to explain the enthusiasm for amateur military theorizing in Washington these days over this kind of thing. What's happening in the case of Iran is relatively simple. The Iranians, we have to learn to live with a nuclear Iran. There is no alternative. We set it up. Iran is a large and important country. It's surrounded by nuclear powers. The Soviet Union to the north, the United States in the Persian Gulf, Israel in the west, India and Pakistan on its borders. The only way you can possibly, and then along comes a president who says that he's committed to preventive war. That's what the Japanese did to us in December 1941. He's committed to preventive war, and then he comes out with a list of countries that he believes it's in the interest of the United States to use military force to bring about regime change. He calls them the axis of evil, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. We, of course, attacked the one that we knew didn't have nuclear weapons, and that's precisely what we're talking about here. The only way you could defend yourself against such a threat, which is now made credible by the invasion of Iraq and what has actually occurred there, is to have a retaliatory capacity. As de Gaulle put it, the ability to tear off an arm. That will slow the Americans down. Everybody knows that. I mean, we used to say that that's what had happened in North Korea. They didn't actually have a bomb. They just went around and they painted buckets red and wrote atom bomb on it. And the news took care of the rest. They were always extremely rational people that saw what they were facing. And their answer to this, as it's Churchillian, the Americans say they're going to attack us. Well, if you've got to go, take one with you, as Churchill said at the height of the Blitz. And if the Americans are going to attack us, we intend to take out the city of Seoul, as many American military bases in Okinawa as we possibly can, as many Japanese cities as we can. They don't have much of a capacity to do that, but it has now become a credible threat. At the same time, there's nothing easier to deter than a thing like that. The easiest thing on earth is to tell where a nuclear-tipped missile came from. And we have the capacity, technological. We don't even have to depend on any employee to know where it came from. And if if Israel were attacked by Iran, Iran would disappear the next day.
It would take that long.
Well, it wouldn't actually take that long, but the president goes to bed early, and he would have to push the button. That's part of our rituals.
I think Cheney could do it.
Yeah. So that I see, and I think we've known for some time, that Iran will be relatively easily deterred from ever using its weapon, but that it will stop this nonsense of the Israelis believing that they are beyond, that they are like us, beyond all forms of international law, capable of exercising anything they want to do in the name of raison d'etat, and maintaining this gross and overwhelming military power, contemptuous of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, that is the tragedy of it's not tolerating Israel that I'm thinking of, the tragedy of our playing along with Israel, tolerating the kinds of things that they have been doing, is that it probably affects Israeli security more severely than anything else. They get themselves more and more isolated all the time. The old nation in arms doesn't work very well anymore, and it's just extremely dangerous situation. But the signs of life in the country are that we're told now. This is the few smart journalists who work for the Washington Post and who follow the Pentagon closely, that an attack on an American attack or an ordered attack on Iran will lead to a high command mutiny in the American armed forces. That seems like a distinct possibility right now. They're actually in some ways so disgusted by their very hard work after Vietnam to try and rebuild the military and then to have it as thoroughly discredited. I mean, right now, this huge high-tech military with 150,000 troops in Iraq has been fought to a standstill by 20,000 insurgents equipped with homemade bombs. You would have thought there would be grounds for an investigation here. Where did the money go?
Yes.
But I don't know that there's anything more that I could say to it, except yes, there is a lot of ominous talk these days. You do occasionally have thoughts that Dick Cheney must think, well, God, I never thought we'd get this far with it anyway. It's the last chance. I've still got the possibility to try and launch it. Let's just go ahead and see where the pieces fall. The thought that would be possible in this country is a measure of how far from the Constitution, the world of Madison, we really are.
Well, let's wind up on an upbeat note. You said that Nemesis is in the house and we're facing bankruptcy. So when do you think it's going to come, and should I buy gold?
Well, bear in mind, those in the audience here who are graduate students in economics at this great university will be aware that what they've been taught about international trade hasn't been true of the United States for a very long time. That is, the world's leading net debtor nation, generally speaking, it's just common sense to not go around insulting your banker that often if you are the world's largest net debtor. But we are dependent upon the Chinese and the Japanese continuing to ship huge amounts of money to us every day in order to keep up our lifestyle. When will this happen? When they decide they don't want to take dollars anymore? It could happen at this moment. If Saudi Arabia decided tomorrow that they wanted to be paid in euros instead of dollars for oil, the United States would collapse right then and there. It would be over. Owarimashita. I'm sorry, I'm breaking into Japanese.
Feel free.
And but right now, all holders of dollars on Earth are quietly, secretively trying to cut their holdings, because once it's apparent what's happening, then the name of the game is don't be the last guy through the door, because by the time you're the last one through the door, this stuff is junk. But that could happen. People in economics departments have been taught for at least 50 years that with a current account deficit of, say, 3% of gross domestic product, you're an economy in very serious trouble, and must have corrective measures at once to wean you off of foreign goods. Well, our current account deficit is at 6% of GDP, and it continues to go ahead as an unbelievably rigged system. You don't know when it's going to happen because it serves so many other people's interests. The Chinese and the Japanese decide to continue to accept more or less disvalued American money in order to continue to maintain high employment in their societies and to continue to develop this industrial base. We don't manufacture much anymore these days except weapons and munitions, and they know that.
We make good ones.
Oh, not bad at all. Actually, they're really rather crappy. I mean,
they fooled us again.
The chapter that I'm really pleased with in Nemesis is the one on space, the ultimate imperialist project.
I like the gravel.
Well, yes, and it's interesting to see the Chinese retaliate. Finally, after we've tried desperately. People around the world have tried desperately to get the Americans on board to actually begin to prevent, through serious international law, the weaponization of space. Of all the things, all the countries that should be interested in this, it's us. We depend on this stuff. I mean, every time you buy anything with your credit card at Walmart or whatever else, whammo, it goes up to a high Earth orbit, gets punched up. Walmart notes that we have one fewer sock than we used to have, or something of that sort. They go on endlessly, is what television depends on it. And now here we are filling up the low Earth orbits with whizzing debris. There are a lot of people predicting, the Johnson Space Center said it's perfectly possible that within a few years the entire planet will simply be enclosed in debris flying at 17,500 miles an hour, the speed of the shuttle, and nobody and space exploration will, for all intents and purposes, cease. We'll never get through it again. Sally Ride, as you may remember, was the commandant of the Challenger before its ultimate unfortunate end. But when she was commandant on, I guess it was her second Challenger flight, a piece of paint hit the windshield on the thing, and she said, I just became panic-stricken. I mean, that is, the gouge it made out of the window. I thought, this thing will not withstand re-entry. It did, and they survived it. But when you start thinking of lens caps, wrenches, junk of one sort or another, things that have not been put into graveyard orbits, the amount of debris is huge. In fact, there's a great deal of strategizing today on what a really rogue nation could totally blind the United States. There goes global positioning systems. Every cell phone around would end at once by just firing just firing a couple of truckloads of gravel in the low Earth orbit, and let it spin around and kill all our satellites.
I'll contribute to that.
It would take them right out, and all of a sudden, no more electronic battlefield or anything else. We're dependent on this stuff. But the Johnson Space Center publishes a very interesting global debris newsletter, which is, well, the Air Force tries to keep track of, it's somewhere around 17,000 pieces of junk that are floating in low Earth orbit. If they're in high Earth orbit, they're there forever. They will never anything happen to them unless we start developing outer space garbage trucks that which might not be a too stupid approach to the way things are going. But the Chinese got so irritated at this the other day that they just took one of their took a high-powered rocket and knocked out one of their old satellites. When a satellite goes dead, it's dead. There's no way to repair it. But the amount of debris they unleashed with this thing was fantastic. It's the latest Space Debris newsletter has a wonderful tale of a old Chinese second-stage rocket rear-ending a piece of American junk from the 1980s. It broke into 5 more large pieces of junk that all have to be recorded and charted. And that's astrophysics these days.
Well, on that note of hope, particularly if we can just get rid of television, I think that's a great idea. So, Sasha, is it time for Q&A? Thank you, Chalmers.
Of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is a, let me just say, if I could. Let me just make a comment. I'm awfully pleased to have this as a KPFA sponsored affair. Very few people realize that back in the Cenozoic, in the 1950s, when I was a graduate student at this university, I was reading the Chinese and Japanese press over KPFA in the days of old Elsa Knight Thompson. Most of you don't remember her. She could actually light a kitchen match on her leg. It was a fantastic trick that always impressed my young and inexperienced view of the world. But also, to be here with Gary Brecken is truly important. My colleague in San Diego, Mike Davis, you've mentioned him several times. Well, you're certainly the Mike Davis of around here.
Oh, thank you.
It's a very
high compliment.
Can you hear me now? Yes, all right. So we have some questions from the audience. The first one is, if Dick Cheney were to be indicted, would this change your conclusions?
No. That is to say, it would take out Cheney, obviously. I guess it is conceivable if we carry this game along, we could get Nancy Pelosi moved further up a rank or two. But I don't see that this is what we're talking about. Cheney is a serious problem for us, no question. But to say that that's the sort of thing that's affecting the United States is simply absurd. Our problems are much more serious than any individual man.
So another person in the audience asks, do any of your inside the Beltway contacts share your alarm at the current situation?
There's a few who do, yes. On the back of Nemesis, you'll find a plug by Ray McGovern, ex of the CIA, rather famous analyst, and also the head of, I can't remember the exact title of his organization today, but Intelligence Analysts for Peace, or something of that sort.
Sanity, I think.
Pardon me?
I think it's Sanity.
It's Sanity. It's for Sanity, yeah. In writing his plug, the publisher refused to use it all. The last line he put in was, Chalmers, I'm so pleased that you finally finished your book. I'll see you in Guantanamo Bay. Now, he's already been reading up on Cuban affairs of his own.
A tropical vacation.
But no, Potomac fever is such an insidious disease that most of them are not actually paying. They can't imagine that they will not go on forever.
All right. So another question is, do you think 9/11 was an inside job? What about Cheney's role?
Well, I don't actually think it was an inside job. I think it was an active asymmetric warfare planned very effectively by Al-Qaeda and well executed. I grant you there's been published an awful lot of odd engineering information. But I still don't think it was done on the back lot at Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada and then sold to the rest of the world. Sorry, it seems implausible to me that that is the case. It does begin to suggest that maybe some building inspectors in New York City have a couple of things to answer for.
All right. How can we overcome the one-party system which the Democrat-Republican duopoly has wrought? It seems that true constitutionalism cannot flourish so long as minority parties are excluded from the political process.
Well said, but I do not see how that will be altered. There are so many other anomalies. I'm tired of having who is nominated chosen by such backward states as New Hampshire and Iowa. I'm tired of having our electoral constituencies made up of such weird affairs as our state system, and any number of things that cry out for reform of an 18th century constitution. But that's the way it is right now, and that's why I believe it's very hard to see the way out, though obviously, what do we think we're doing here? We're trying to mobilize inattentive citizens to what they're about to lose and how important it will be to them once it's gone. They'll never get it back. That's what we're... Now then, whether this is simply whistling past the graveyard, whether it's possible to make any difference at all is still an open question. There have been mass movements in the United States that in the past have made an impact, particularly the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
Well, maybe you touched on this a little with your advice about the house in Vancouver, but that
wasn't advice. It was just...
the question is, as we enter the last days, what can younger people do and expect? The older generation has a little less to lose. Do we move, etc.?
Well, precisely. There's nothing further really to say about it, except that, of course, man makes himself. You must prepare your own escape route. You must think about these things and start asking yourself, you know, how many different kind of passports do we have in our family? What languages do we speak? Would you really like to live in New Zealand? I've been there. It's so bucolic, the sheep sleep on their backs with their feet in the air. I remember the wife of the man who invited me, an extremely pleasant woman, was driving me around Auckland. We were looking for New Zealand amber, and I remember at one point over lunch, she simply turned to me and said, "I'd kill for 2 weeks in Sydney." And I said, "By God, has she got cabin fever?" I mean, so beware of what you ask for. Some beautiful New Zealand, but a little dull. But of course, it is the responsibility of young people to start thinking about the future of the country and to be aware that they are deeply caught up in it and that the future may not be good. I mean, if we were holding this conversation in, say, 1985, and I had said to you, 4 years from now, the Soviet Union will not exist, you'd have thought, this guy inhales too deeply on a contraband substance. That he's not a good judge of these things. It's gone. Russia is a much smaller place than the former Soviet Union was. Essentially the same things that happened to it are happening to us. Imperial overstretch, extreme economic rigidity, ideological rigidity, inability to reform. They went first because they were always poorer than we were. One of the biggest mistakes we ever made was to conclude that we won the Cold War. Both countries lost the Cold War. They went first. Gorbachev tried reform. He's really one of the few cases in history we know of an imperialist who was getting rid of the empire. He knew that he would rather have friendly relations with France and Germany than he would with those crummy satellites in Eastern Europe that Stalin had created. And he tried it. He ran head-on into vested interests so powerful that he was unable to make headway. Are there vested interests in this country? You know, to ask the question is to answer it. So that empires go fast. That is, they go really with the speed of FedEx these days. I mean, in my lifetime, I've seen the fall of the Nazi, the Imperial Japanese, British, French, Dutch, Portuguese, Soviet. That's a lot of empires to go down. And they come along very suddenly. It seems all of a sudden it just becomes apparent to everyone that the farce is over. That's unfortunately what I think we're starting to begin to face in this country today. There's a really genuinely, qualitatively different understanding of the country and its problems that existed prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union.
How can we ignore 240 billion barrels of oil up for grabs in the Middle East?
Well, I don't think we do ignore it. I wish we could. I mean, without question, the two main pillars of American foreign policy in the Middle East were the relationships with Saudi Arabia, created by Franklin Roosevelt and pioneered by the Standard Oil Company of California, that went into the great and extremely successful consortium called the Arabian American Oil Company, Aramco, with the overwhelming advice put on Aramco: don't behave like the British in Iran. Get along. Learn. Don't take your wives. Don't mess around in this country. These people don't have the same religion you do, and don't expect them to. We did that for years, and it worked fine. Slowly, over the years, we've lost track of that, and Saudi Arabia began to restrict seriously our presence in the country after the first Gulf War, to the point that Prince Sultan Air Base at Riyadh became essentially functionless. We moved our main CENTCOM headquarters to Qatar, from which Franks and company carried out the attack on Iraq. The other central pillar was, of course, Iran. We destroyed Iran by becoming a flunky of the British Empire in 1953, bringing to power the Shah and his notorious police state, led by Savak, which was then overthrown in 1979, bringing to power the Ayatollah Khomeini, and we have been at loggerheads with the Iranians ever since. It's unlikely that we will ever have influence in this important country again. These were both extremely serious foreign policy failures of the sort for which governments are normally held responsible. Our answer, as plotted, we now know from numerous insiders in the Pentagon who have come out and spoken, particularly Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kitofsky, who resigned on the day of the invasion, and an extremely admirable person, in my view, but who has said that without doubt the purpose of the war was not even to particularly protect Israel or anything of that sort. It was to establish a new main base for the United States in the Middle East, with southern Eurasia having been opened up to imperialist penetration as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union. We refuse ever to say that we are not building permanent bases in Iraq. 5 of them are as permanent as you can get. KBR pours just unbelievable amounts of concrete at every one of them all the time. The Congress goes out of its way to say this is not on our agenda. We don't ask about it. We don't pay attention. We certainly don't pay attention to how the money is spent in building these bases. We know full well that we did not have a plan for ending the Iraq War because we did not intend to leave. It was an imperialist activity on our part to take over the place. Now, whether it was to say that it was oil that is driving all this, I think oil is certainly an important element in it, but probably oil is also equally important to our neocon plotters as a means of influence over countries like China and others that are also net fuel importers, and that they wanted to control it, just as they tried very seriously under the Clinton administration, more seriously than these amateurs, to build American military bases in the former Soviet Central Asian republics, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, particularly those two. We've been thrown out of one now. The price of our bases in the other have gone from $5 million a year to $200 million a year. We're not handling any of this very well, but the purpose there, of course, was Caspian Sea oil. Oil is a very important element in it, but I'm inclined to say that imperialism was more important. That is our intent to dominate the world, full spectrum dominance, as the Air Force says.
Could I just add that the U.S. military is the largest single consumer of oil in the world, so without it, of course, the military can simply not work.
Well, as it stands right now, of course, it is the fuel that makes the thing go. That's JP1, jet fuel, is made of oil.
You quoted Voltaire in your book, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." How has the American public been changed by its acceptance of so many absurdities?
Well, that is a good question. I was trying to deal with that in the first chapter in an unusual manner, and one that most editors would advise against. Do not ever, 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 under any circumstances, make a Nazi comparison with something that the Americans are doing. It's the third rail. Don't do it. Any intelligent editor would take it out at once. One of the things that interested me a great deal in the torture scandals, the ordering of torture. We now know it was ordered. That is, at the time of that the photographs from Abu Ghraib were released in 2003, there was a sign up in the Pentagon that of the 6 enlisted men and women who were arrested by the Army Intelligence Services for these crimes. These are the 6 morons who lost the war. In my book, I have 7 morons. And they start with the president and go down through several high-ranking generals who allowed this to occur, who ordered it to occur. But one of the things that I was drawn to was in Hannah Arendt's famous study of Adolf Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem. As you all know, she ended the book in an ambiguous way that became greatly influential. She said, so illustrates the banality of evil. She never said what she meant by banality of evil. She never used it except in the very last line of the book. But later in life, she and her executors spent a great deal of time discussing the banality of evil, and she, in some new essays that have recently been published posthumously, we now know that what she meant by it was the inability to think, not stupidity. One of the most interesting things that happened in the Eichmann trial, Eichmann forever stressed that he was a very well-educated and quite devout and sincere man. Judge Landau asked him at one point, in that case, please explain to me Kant's categorical imperative. Arendt writes that I never heard it better expressed, that there is no question that Adolf Eichmann was perfectly familiar with Immanuel Kant and was able to recite precisely what he had in mind. But that what was wrong with Eichmann is that he had ceased to think. He had become a bureaucrat. He had become a functionary. He was a railroad dispatcher of death, people to the death camps. I thought of this when you thought of the when you saw the pictures. It came back today again, also looking at Botero's paintings over in the library. There was one sergeant in Abu Ghraib prison, Sergeant Darby. He's been heavily persecuted within the Army since then, but he also had a computer disk with photographs from what was going on there, and he looked at them and said, this is abhorrent. This is not what any army should be doing. It's a war crime. And he sent his disk to the Army Criminal Investigation Department, and that then led to General Takuba's investigation and things of this sort. I'd like to remember Sergeant Darby as one who had not ceased to think. He was able to think in a way that Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at that time, General Richard Myers, clearly had. Myers has been using the excuse of 3 bad apples so many times for military atrocities around the world. That man has actually planted orchards of bad apples around the world, and we turned out to be in the right place for his president at the time. But what has it done to the public? I don't understand why the public is able to tolerate an attorney general who comes out and says that or then presidential legal counsel, that the Geneva treaties on the protection of prisoners of war and civilians in wartime are now obsolete. The Constitution makes clear that a signed, ratified treaty is a supreme law of the land. It covers everything else. No attorney general, no president, no secretary of defense has any authority to tamper with this at all. Why are the public so gullible? Why do they take it with such effrontery thrown up to them as the torture memos, the memos that were written to justify this sort of thing? We seem to have stopped thinking.
In April 2005, a group organized a UC teach-in on torture, sponsored by 3 UC departments and over 100 faculty endorsers. We found that the university press office would not distribute our press release, and we were denied the use of any UC auditorium on the claim that none were available, rather. Do you agree that the main obstacles to coalescence of a national resistance movement are at the level of local institutions and their collaboration with imperialism?
I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. I can't say that the University of California at San Diego would have done it any better. They would have been scared as usual, or something of that sort. They seem to forget what the functions of these institutions are, and to just simply, again, not thinking, behaving like Adolf Eichmann in his extremely efficient movement of millions of people to death camps. But what stops mass mobilization is, I'm sure, more than simply local institutions. It is the extreme complexity and diversity of life in this country.
And I should just say that there is an irony of having the Botero show on a campus which also hosts the man perhaps most responsible for it, John Yoo, teaching constitutional law at Bolt Law School. An absolute shame to my university.
Don't think you're exclusive, though. All law schools have 1 or 2. There's Dershowitz at Harvard.
Oh, that's right. Mm-hmm.
We just have time for just a few more questions. I believe that Saddam Hussein was beginning to use euros and not dollars right before the invasion. Right before the invasion. Do you think this was in part the reason for the war?
It's really possible, but the information I have, and the more you read on the subject, it seems as though Saddam Hussein, that his problem was, one of his problems was he didn't have nuclear weapons. But that that was a serious problem for him. But that he wasn't taking the United States seriously. That is, the countries that he felt menaced by were Iran and Israel. He didn't really think, he thought the United States was bluffing, just as he was in many ways playing a bluff game too, to pretend to be more powerful than he actually was. So that I think that he was surprised by Mr. Ulmer's shock and awe tactics and the belief that he could be bombed into submission. It's hard to, but again, I don't know precisely what the kind of reasoning that went on inside the Iraqi government as they came closer to the Americans delivering on their threats. I think the threats were so extreme, so outrageous, that it would have been, in almost any ordinary government, difficult to take them seriously. That you would have come to believe after a while that these people will self-destruct, they're going too far, this is Mao Zedong in the Cultural Revolution, that it's fascinating to monitor, but it's no longer of any importance. They're just fools that are making serious mistakes. I don't think that he truly imagined that our military high command would have confidence in these fantastical ideas enough to order the troops into battle. But there's a lot that nobody fully understood. That is, that this was our professional army. Service in the armed forces today is not an obligation of citizenship, as it was for me when I was in the Navy back in the Korean War. It is a career choice, very commonly most commonly taken by people who come from blocked cul-de-sacs or dead ends in our society. 50% of the women in the armed forces come from national minorities. It's perfectly understandable. It's a root of social mobility. What was her name? You remember Jessica Lynch, who was shot up rather badly. Her colleagues were killed at Nasiriyah in the assault on Baghdad. I remember the press asked her, "Why did you join the army?" She says, "I'm from Palestine, West Virginia. I couldn't get a job at Walmart." I mean, what did I join the army for? It was to get out. I was also told that I wasn't going to be shot at, that I was a supply clerk, and I drove a truck down the wrong road in Iraq. This change, the high command likes this military arrangement. I'm not obviously going to try and make a case for the draft, but I'll tell you, if you're in the armed forces when it is an obligation of citizenship, everybody becomes much more sensitive to what the war is about, whether the officers know what they're doing, becomes sensitive to how things were raised. If you've never read Christian Appy's Working Class War on Vietnam, do so. It's an absolute classic of things that should be understood. The number of Yale graduates killed in Vietnam is 1. We've many times commented, how in the hell did that guy not get the word? You know, that if he only stayed in the library and let the dissertation run on to 1,000 pages, he'd have pulled a Cheney. But in our wisdom, there's sort of signs of things starting to slip. Rather than make the draft equitable, we chose to abolish it. And that changes the world overnight.
One final question.
Yes.
You spoke of empire mainly in terms of territorial occupation and bases. Does empire also take an economic form?
Say that again, please.
Can empire take an economic form?
Oh, yes, of course. There are many, many people ask...
And does it now?
Yeah, many people ask, what makes you really think that the United States is an empire? That by empire, most Americans think or are taken in by the marvelous cottage industry of predifying the British Empire, which goes on endlessly, about how how lucky people were to be colonized by Englishmen. Those books really sell well in Ireland, believe me.
And Wales.
Exactly. I mean, before this year is over, the United Kingdom may break up. Scotland is thinking of going independent, as you know, and with good reason. There are other kinds of empires, and clearly economic empires and neocolonialism, the sorts of relationships that we've had with Latin America since the Monroe Doctrine are classic examples of a different kind of empire. The sort of empire I had in mind was the one the Soviet Union created in Eastern Europe after World War II. That is, the military occupation of territories, creating satellites with friendly puppet governments oriented toward Moscow and their economies integrated into the Soviet bloc. That's the sort of empire we have. Its unit is not the colony. It's, as of the current count, 737 American military bases in every continent on Earth. The number comes in something called the Base Structure Report. It's an annual inventory of our bases around the world, and the Pentagon's guess at what the plant replacement value, what it would cost to replace them, would be. The number is clearly greater than 737. Nobody really knows the full number. All the espionage bases are left out. The bases, there's a couple of them in Israel that are left out. All the bases in England are disguised as Royal Air Force bases. There are no Englishmen on them, but they are listed as Royal Air Force bases. That was an administrative agreement made back in the late 1940s. And then there are many places where we have bases that is simply too embarrassing for the country to acknowledge that they exist here. So the number is probably around 1,000, but it is assuredly an empire just as much as the Roman Empire, the Roman colonies, the world of Roman possessions under the Roman Republic destroyed the Roman Republic.
Well, thank you so much, Chalmers Johnson, Gray Brecken.
Thank you so much.
You did a wonderful job.
Oh, thank
you. Nemesis is the final volume in Chalmers Johnson's American Empire trilogy. His other books are Blowback, The Costs and Consequences of American Empire, and The Sorrows of Empire, Militarism, Secrecy, and the End of the Republic. Learn.
America knows that date. March 11th, 1973, the day the CIA overthrew... I beg your pardon? Oh, September, I beg your pardon. Yeah, I was thinking the month we're living in now, right? September 11th, 1973, the day that we overthrew the government of Salvador Allende in Chile and installed probably the most odious dictator on either side in the Cold War, General Augusto Pinochet. It could have been Okinawans, it could have been Greeks, it could have been any number of people that have legitimate reasons to wish to attack us. Nemesis is a different story. You wanted to hear about that one, yes, too. Nemesis, as all of you, or a good many of you will know, is the Greek goddess of revenge, of the attacker of hubris, of arrogance. She is classically portrayed as a bright young woman with a whip in one hand and a scale in the other. She was a very legitimate and high-class goddess. She was the sister of Erato, the goddess of love poetry. Probably Edith Hamilton in her great work on Greek mythology says that probably the greatest single act of Nemesis was she's the one who came across Narcissus in the forest and led him to the pond and showed him his reflection in the water, and he fell in love with it and dove in and drowned. The sort of things that... But I'm contending that Nemesis is present in the country today, biding her time before she starts settling the scores with some people who have shown remarkable hubris. The essential argument of Nemesis is simply that there is no, politically, history tells us there is no more unstable configuration than that of the United States today, namely a domestic democracy and an external empire. You can do one, you can do the other. You can't do both. They are fundamentally conflict with each other. I try to explain why they are and what happens when you try to do both. The class as such, but who did at least help perfect the Praetorian Guards, which became very important in Roman history. He was then succeeded by a drooling idiot, Claudius, whose wife fed him a poisoned mushroom to get rid of him, and for the sake of her son by an earlier marriage, namely Nero. Now, I mention these characters simply to say this is not good government, no matter how you look at it. This is, I mean, the Republic may have. The alternative, I try to suggest, if you can find it, there are not many cases of the opposite. There are very few cases of empires that ever gave up. Gorbachev is probably the only one in recent times that really did. But I argue that the British Empire, after World War II, against Nazism and in view of the record of Nazism that had been put on for the world to see and to understand, or to attempt to understand, that in these circumstances, the British realized they could not hang on to the jewel in the crown of their empire, India, without resorting to, as they had so many times in the past, administrative massacres. Administrative massacres would not have been, that is, in order to continue to carry them out, Britain would have had to transform itself into a tyranny. There would have been really no alternative. Therefore, they gave up their empire. It wasn't too hard for them to do because they did have the United States that they could come under its wing. But they gave up the empire, particularly India, for the sake of maintaining domestic democracy. I believe it's something we in America ought to be thinking very, very hard about ourselves. Our empire is now, the official count, 737 American military bases in well over 130 countries. And they provide nothing that we need or want, but they're simply expensive and they're a form of hegemony. Now, the British didn't do a very good job of this. There were huge examples are, of course, the Roman Republic, which is important to us because so many of our constitutional provisions were adapted from the Roman Republic, which succumbed after the assassination of Julius Caesar and the rise of Octavian to military dictatorship. Democracy did not return for at least 1,000 years. It was the first great experiment in large-scale experiment in political democracy, and it failed in a way that would be easy to expect today in the United States. That is to say, militarists. By this time, the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic, had acquired an empire rather thoughtlessly, much like the United States. Paid not much attention to it. Took it as its due, and the old legions that were raised among the citizenry for purposes of defense had now become standing armies with huge vested interests, great problems of what to do with the troops after they became redundant. They were long service troops by now. Under those circumstances, exploitative militarists, Caesar being easily the best example, began to think that they might champion the interests of the armed forces in return for life dictatorship. That's precisely what did happen, and whether you, I mean, if you know you're given, you would think that the first, that is Octavian declaring himself to be the god Augustus Caesar, was not a bad thing, that this was a big improvement over the endless bickering and arguments of the wonderfully balanced Roman Senate. But do bear in mind what followed Augustus Caesar. Then came Tiberius, who withdrew to Capri with a boatload of young boys for his sexual tastes. He was succeeded by Caligula, a genuine madman, rightly understood as.
He spoke about it recently at Martin Luther King Middle School in Berkeley, California, for about an hour, 45 minutes.
Well, Chalmers, let's just get the... Oh, sorry.
How is this?
Thank you for not being shy. Is this okay? I hate nuance. That's so French. We wouldn't want to be that. Chalmers, why don't we just get the essential out of the way right off the bat? Would you explain blowback and nemesis?
Blowback is a CIA term. It's used first in the after-action report on the first overthrow of a foreign government we ever carried out, that in 1953 against Mohammad Mossadegh of Iran for the sake of the British Petroleum Company. We accused him of being a communist. Pope would have probably been a better candidate. It does not mean just retaliation. Obviously, that's what it means, is retaliation. It means retaliation for acts committed abroad that were kept totally secret from the American public, so that when the retaliation comes, they're unable to put them in context to see cause and effect. The best example being, of course, September 11th, 2001, which was retaliation by former assets and associates of ours against us for the largest single clandestine activity we ever carried out, namely the recruiting, arming, sending into battle of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union in the 1980s. Osama bin Laden was the sort of person you would have logically expected to meet as a house guest at Kennebunkport, Maine, in the first, that is, and he became so disgusted by the way we walked away from Afghanistan after the Soviet Union withdrew in 1988 that he and his associates have been after us for some time. Certainly 2001 was not out of the blue, and it was not a clash of civilizations. He had very, very specific things in mind, made it clear to the world within a week after 9/11. In fact, he went out of his way to say that there are three things that we had in mind. I mention them simply because they're all casus belli. They're not grand statements of clash of values, or we dislike you because of your democracy or your wealth or whatever else. He said that we attacked the United States because of your placing American troops in Saudi Arabia after the first Gulf War. We disliked intensely the use of non-believers charged with defending the House of Fahd, which is responsible for the safety of the two most sacred sites in Islam, Mecca and Medina. He said that you Americans will never know peace so long as you continue to back Israeli aggression against the Palestinian people and the seizure of their land. And third, he properly accused us of killing at least 500,000 Iraqi children in the most fierce set of sanctions we ever imposed on any country, that is against Iraq during the 1990s under Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright. Again, these are perfectly recognizable reasons for asymmetric warfare, as to use a bit of Pentagon jargon, but I prefer it to terrorism. And they followed along a long pattern that had been going. But that's blowback, is basically saying, that is, I wrote the book well before 9/11 with East Asia in mind, thinking that the main foreign policy problems of the 21st century were going to be things left over from the last century as they came back to haunt us. In fact, even on March 11th itself, I was chatting with my publisher in New York about, once we had known that it was a terrorist incident, that it didn't cross our minds at once at all that they were Islamic terrorists, least of all Saudi Arabians. The first thought we had, March 11th, everybody in Latin